Hey, my friends. So let's talk about fantasy tropes and cliches. So first off, what's the difference between a trope and a cliche? Well, if you go and you look up lists of fantasy cliches and you look up lists of fantasy tropes, you'll see a lot of the same things mentioned in both lists, and that's because basically a trope is executed well and a cliche is not executed well. That's the difference. One is something that is done in a way that we like, and the other one is not done in a way that we like. That's all it is. So I want to go through some of these the common tropes and cliches that are seen in a lot of these lists that I've thought about in the past. And let's see. I'm talking about like if I do these things or if I think that they're okay to do. Anyway, so first off, racial homogenization. Racial homogenization. What does that mean? Like all the in Tolkien, all the dwarves dig underground. They're all miners. They all really like gold and silver and stuff. And all the elves are have they're all very beautiful, and it's stuff like that. And you see it in a lot of fantasy settings. You see this where they make they'll give you a whole race of people, and they'll make sweeping statements about them. Now, do I think that's good? I think it's acceptable to some degree because the reality is that cultural patterns exist, right? For any given culture, you can make certain general statements that may not be true for everyone in that culture, but it is still an observable trend, right? And as long as you allow for the individual to possibly depart from that trend and maybe give some examples of that, I think it's a fine thing to do. Just like racial and cultural divisions in the real world. I mean, you can say, oh, this group of people tends to be a little more this way sometimes. I don't think that's racist or bad, or not necessarily racist or bad, as long as you realize that individuals are still individuals, and even if you have trends, that doesn't mean that speaks for every single person, right? So yeah, I think as long as there's some nuance to that, I think it's fine. Exposition. Exposition. That's one of my peeves. I really get bored fast when there's lots of exposition. And that's why if you read my books, I don't do much exposition. I have to kind of force myself to do it. I actually have the opposite problem. My readers, they get going, and my beta readers, they say, okay, hold on, I have no idea what's going on because you didn't explain this, right? I just kind of assume that people can read between the lines, and I just jump into the action, right? So yeah, exposition. If I pick up a fantasy book and they want to give me 20 pages of history right at the beginning, I just say, oh, I'm not interested in that. I want to see characters. I want to see conflicts. I want to see the story going. You can give me bits and pieces of exposition here and there, but don't just start dumping lots and lots of exposition on me in the beginning, or anywhere actually. Just give it and feed it to me bits and pieces here and there. Um, Obvious or pure good or evil. This is a big one for Tolkien, and I think Tolkien had a lot of influence on other writers in this regard. Like the orcs in Tolkien, they're just evil, and they're visibly evil. They're clearly evil, and there aren't really any good orcs. And the best thing that you can do if you want to have sympathy for orcs, the best thing you can do for them is put them out of their misery and kill them. Um, I think that one of the reasons that that's such a big thing in fantasy is that we want a world like that in a way. We want a world that's simple, where we can just categorize people quickly, right? It's very tempting to to do that in the real world, but that's why we have racism, right? And nationalism and things, and and so I think because it's something that we want, I think it's something that's very attractive in fantasy, and writers like to put it there, readers like to have it there. Um, to some extent, I think it's okay. The whole good and evil thing. In fact, I don't want to read a story where there's no good and no evil, and because when I read a story like that, actually, I tend to feel that everyone's evil. So I don't want that. I want real moral conflicts, but I also want a certain level of complexity, and I think you see that in my characters. Um, But at the same time, I still want there to be like a very a good force and an evil force that are fighting against each other and manifesting in different ways. So that's again that's something that I think is okay to have in fantasy fiction. You just have to express it well, right? The chosen one, the chosen one. Again, it's another fun thing, and you see it a lot in fantasy because people like it. It's fun. It's interesting. They like the idea of having or being the chosen one, right? And that's why people want to read that. It can get a little boring to see that in everything. It does. Yeah, it's cliche. It's cliche, but I still think that it can be done well, right? Um, and I think that you can make it interesting by first making it not necessarily clear who the chosen one is. Like Robert Jordan did that for a while in Wheel of Time. Make it not necessarily clear what the chosen one's supposed to do. Not necessarily clear whether or not the chosen one is good. Maybe the chosen one, like, this person knows that he or she is important, but doesn't know if they're supposed to be good or bad, right? I think that's one way to make it interesting. There are different ways to make it interesting, so you can have it, but don't be simplistic with it. You need to do something about it to make it a little different. Um, man's world, a man's world. I think it's very easy for fantasy stories, especially ones in kind of a medieval or earlier setting, to be have a man's world, right? Because that's, let's be honest, that's how society evolved, and there's a reason for that. Like I think that, basically speaking, if you go way back in tribal societies, what happened was like they're always fighting against each other all the time, and men are just naturally stronger and more aggressive, right? So men would be the ones. Oh, and they're also more expendable in in the reproductive cycle. Um, but so the men would be the ones to go and fight, and naturally, if a man went and led in battle and showed himself to be a leader in battle, he would end up. People would want to follow him as a leader generally, right? And so you have men arising as leaders throughout the world in most societies, but not all. There have been matriarchal societies in our world, but most of the time they were patriarchal. That's just kind of the way things happen, and, until you start to reach the modern era, and then you start to see more equality and more of a matriarchal influence. Um, so on the one hand, it's okay to have it to some extent because that's just kind of is how things happened. But to have it in there isn't necessarily to believe that it's okay. And I think you can show that it's not okay, and you can show the problems with it, and also you can show a certain um, resistance to that and make it a good plot point for some of the characters, right? Yeah, sure, maybe the women in the society are generally not assertive and don't leave the home and don't become very influential in the world, but you can have a character who does, and that's what makes her interesting, right? Um, dragons. Dragons. I love dragons. I don't have a dragon yet in any of my stories. I love dragons. I don't. I actually read a discussion on a fantasy forum recently talking about dragons, saying like, are they overdone? Um, no, I don't think they are. I think it's dragons can be overdone if you don't do anything interesting with them. But dragons can definitely be a part of your story. I don't know if I'll ever put dragons in my stories. I might at some point. I would like to, but only if I can find a good way of doing it to make it interesting. I do like dragons. I wouldn't say like, oh, that's cliche, don't do it. It's just it has its place, right? And you need to be interesting with it. Names you can't pronounce. Yeah, I think it's important to have a convincing language environment for your world. I don't like how a lot of fantasy worlds have it where everyone just happens to speak the same language. Mine is not like that. Like it shows that people speak different languages and sometimes they don't understand each other. Um, but in doing that, when you come up with these different languages, it's it's very easy to fall on this problem of creating names that are very difficult to pronounce. And I think that's just going to happen to some extent if you're really putting an effort into creating different languages, right, and being convincing about it. Because as I've noticed, someone who speaks Mandarin, I can tell you that almost every instance in which people try to read a romanized version of a Mandarin name, they mispronounce it. It's terrible. Um, but so this is going to happen to some extent. But I guess what I would say is I would never create a name intentionally making it difficult to pronounce. I find that obnoxious and very off-putting. Um, quests, going on quests like Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring. Going on quests to throw the ring into Mount Doom. Um, quests are, they're good in fantasy. I don't think every fantasy story should have a quest in that sense. In another sense, you can say that every story has a quest because you have characters trying to accomplish something, right? Um, but I, in the sense of high fantasy quest, I do think that's overdone in the simplest sense. But you can still do it. Again, just do it well, make it interesting, make it original. Um, in my stories, in that I've written so far, Den of the Wolfman, Wild River, I don't really have quests. I mean, Den of the Wolfman, Bondas is trying to catch a serial killer, right? I wouldn't call it a quest. Wild River, um, there's not really a quest in Wild River. They're trying to find a missing woman, and there's there are tensions between different groups in the city of Wild River that flare up and become a full conflict. But there isn't really a quest yet. But I do have the first the first elements of a quest that is beginning to shape up in that book. So like later in the series, I think you could probably say that there's going to be a quest of some kind. Deus Ex Machina, and you see that a lot, specifically with magic, especially with like with soft magic. I think too often in fantasy, writers try to just use magic as a way of getting out of situations when they don't know what else to do. They have their characters in a corner, trapped. They're gonna die. Like, oh wait, but magic, right? Yeah, that's a big danger in fantasy. Don't do that. I try not to do that. Um, I like magic. It's an important part of fantasy. I think that, and I've talked about this before, I like hard magic systems better because you can't resort to Deus Ex Machina as easily with that. Um, taverns, yeah, I don't. The whole thing about heroes meeting up in taverns and stuff like that, it's not. That's not really something I do in my stories. Again, I mean, you can do it, just don't do it too much. Um, the overqualified party. I think I may be a little bit guilty of this. The overqualified party. You have all these people with crazy powers, coming together for whatever reason. They just happen to run into each other, to be involved in the same things, and become part of the same group. Um, I've I kind of have that happen in my stories. I think that, but you need to have some explanation for it. If you can give some believable explanation for why this would happen, why these people would come together, then it kind of works. But you need to try to make it a little believable, not just happen to have them all come together just because. But anyway, when it comes to tropes in general, or cliches or whatever, I think what I would say to a lot of people is, yeah, these things, they're okay, and they're even lovely if they're executed well. And if they're not executed well, then they're not. Then I don't like them. But if you just have a deep hatred for any of these tropes, I think that I shouldn't say any of them. There's some that I don't really like. But if you have a like deep hatred, like for dragons, if you say like, oh, I'll never read a story with dragons, I think maybe the problem is not the trope. Maybe the problem is you don't. It's not that you dislike the trope. It's that you just dislike fantasy, and that's okay. You don't have to like fantasy. But yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe you just don't like fantasy. I think that it's inevitable to have certain tropes in your story when you write fantasy. I'm all for originality, but at some level you're going to be touching on existing tropes. That's just how it is, and it's just like I said, it's a matter of executing well and doing that. So anyway, I'm going to put the link to Den of the Wolfman below. again, if you want to get that, if you haven't gotten it yet, you can go get the free download below. Again, in a few weeks, I'm going to be releasing Wild River. It's coming along. It's finished, but I'm going back and putting finishing touches on it. Going to be releasing in a few weeks. Very exciting. Let me know what you think of Den of the Wolfman. You know, this is I've enjoyed writing these stories, but I want to get more feedback from readers. See what you like, what you don't like. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Bye.